All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. So thanks again for joining me. My name is Kevin Hancock, Director of Solutions here at Exostar. And today we're going to talk about strengthening cybersecurity through NIST 800-171 self-assessment. Before I dive into the formal session, just want to cover a few housekeeping details. So today's session is scheduled to last 45 minutes to an hour. That does include question and answer. Now, a number of you submitted questions prior to today's session, so those are the ones I'm going to be answering. I've taken those and transposed them onto a slide at the end, and I'll cover those at that time. You're going to be muted during today's presentation. You can submit questions into the chat feature as well. I'll try to get to those at the end as well if we have time. If for some reason we do have an outage, just wait for a minute and try to reconnect. You can do this in a couple of different ways. You can just refresh your screen. That should bring you back into the meeting. Or you can use that email or use the email that you received for today's session. Use that same hyperlink and that should bring you back in today's session. If at any time you'd like to speak with one of our certification assistant experts, or if you have additional questions, you can reach out to us a couple of different ways. You can email us at cmmc-team@exostar.com. You can also come to our website, www.exostar.com. There's a question form on every page on the website, and there's also a chat feature as well. Now, if one of the questions you have is, will I be receiving the slide deck today? The answer is yes. So as a follow-up to today's session, we will be sending the slides as well as sending you a recording of today's session. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So what I'm going to cover today is first, I'm going to give just a brief recap of where we are in the CMMC2 rulemaking process. We'll cover what goes into building your system security plan and how you perform a self-assessment. We're then going to dive into Exostar Certification Assistant application, and I'll show you how that can be utilized to do that self-assessment and to gather and centralize all the information you have about your overall CMMC program. Do just a quick review and recap, and then we'll dive into those questions that were submitted prior to today's session. And then again, if we have time, I'll also take a look at the chat and see if I can answer any questions that came over that avenue as well. All right, so let's dive into today's session. So where we are in the rulemaking process. So what we were waiting for after the rulemaking was complete was for the two portions of the CFR to be put into place, 32 and 48. Now, 32 CFR, and that's the Code of Federal Regulations, that went into effect on December 16th of 2024. What that did is what you see over on the right-hand side of the screen there. That's that Part 170. That defined the CMMC program, what goes into it, the governing cyber AB body, and what this allows us now is to go ahead and have the program in place. It is what authorizes C3PAOs to start to engage with you, or you to engage with C3PAOs, and those are those certified third-party assessment organizations, to do assessments of how you've complied with NIST 800-171 R2. Now, what we're waiting for the program to, if you will, officially be in place is that 48 CFR. 48 CFR is what will put this into federal contracts. That's what still is being worked out. Now, the latest news there is that rule did get moved over to the Office of Management and Budget, that's the OMB, on July 22nd of 2025. They have 90 days to complete their review process. They can ask for an extension, but that's not typical. So, sometime in the next 90 days, that rule will be finalized. And then I believe it's within 60 days after that, you can start to see those clauses appear in federal contracts. Now, just to remind everybody, the major difference of CMMC and what has been done in the past around protecting controlled unclassified information is that this moves from a self-assessment or a self-attestation model where you agree when you sign the contract that you secure information in accordance with NIST 800-171. This requires you to also get that certified third-party assessment once every 3 years that you do those things. And we'll cover this in a little bit of detail just to kind of level set everybody on what those are. It defines some additional terms if you're utilizing third parties to help you do things around your cybersecurity. One of those is if you're utilizing a cloud service. If you're utilizing one of these, and Exostar has a cloud service that secures and protects controlled unclassified information called our managed Microsoft 365, then that cloud service provider needs to be FedRAMP moderate or FedRAMP moderate equivalent. If you're utilizing a managed service provider or a managed security service provider, MSP or MSSP, those folks are going to be assessed as part of your overall controls. So if they've implemented, if they're securing a portion of your network, if they're doing things for you, they and their personnel and the policies and procedures that they do around those things will be taken as part of your overall system security plan. So just to level set everyone again on what CMMC is. So what this does is it breaks the program into 3 levels. The majority of the defense industrial base, right, 63% of the organizations out there that either have DoD contracts or are subcontractors to those that do, fall under level 1. That means you don't receive controlled unclassified information as part of your contract. You only have FCI, federal contract information. And in order to accept those contracts, you have to have in place 15 requirements. Now, if you do receive controlled unclassified information, there's kind of 2 levels that do that, and those are broken into kind of 3 different assessment types. Level 2 self-assessment, and this is a small portion of contracts. The major thing to remember here is level 2 self-assessment is going to be determined by the contracting officer. So whoever lets that contract, they're going to be the ones who either say this is going to be okay for self-assessments, or they're going to require those third-party assessments. Now, the other side of level 2 is those organizations, and this is the majority of those organizations. They're going to be required to have that third-party assessment once every 3 years. What you're going to be assessed on is your implementation of those 110 controls contained within NIST 800-171. And then if you're level 3, and this is also a small number of organizations, right, less than 1% of organizations, you've got to protect information in accordance with NIST 800-171. So you've got those 110 requirements. And then you've got 24 additional requirements from NIST 800-172. That certification is going to be done by DBCAC. That's the audit agency within the Department of Defense that oversees defense industrial base. So when we start to think about these 3 different levels, this will be outlined in the contracts you receive, and those contracts will tell you which of these different levels you need to be cognizant of and agree to in order to be, to be awarded that particular contract. Now, when CMMC comes into effect, right, so once 48 CFR is finalized and published, it'll start to show up in contracts, and then there's going to be an implementation period. This is taken straight from the DoD's website. And so the implementation period is a 3-year implementation. That first year is going to be really what we have today. So level 1 or level 2 are only going to require self-assessments. Phase 2, which is after that first year, that's when you'll start to see level 2 certification be required. Phase 3 will be when you start to see those level 3 DBCAC assessments be required, and then full implementation after that. So full implementation after 36 months, and that first year will be similar to what we have today in self-assessments. Now, hopefully that kind of level sets everybody where we are in the CMMC implementation timeline. What I want to now cover is what you've got to do today, and then we'll cover a little bit about how to do a self-assessment. So now we often get the question of, well, the DoD is changing these things and this is putting a huge burden on small businesses, and what are they doing to help us? Now, the DoD's position here is that for a number of years now, companies have been required to meet the standards of NIST 800-171 if they receive controlled unclassified information. That rule has been in DFARS clauses, I believe, since 2013. So that's that DFARS clause 252.204-7012. Those say that, hey, if you receive controlled unclassified information, you need to protect it in accordance with NIST 800-171. And you attest to that when you assign the contract. So this requirement has been in place for a number of years. And really the only thing that CMMC is doing now is requiring that third-party assessment organization to be the ones who, if you will, verify that you do these things. So you may also have 7019 clauses in your contract. What that requires you to do is do a self-assessment and score yourself. And there's an assessment guide out there. That's the NIST 800-171 Alpha. That's the assessment guide. And it gives you a scoring mechanism. And I'm going to cover that as part of today's session. It gives you a scoring mechanism where you'll score yourself on if you've implemented a particular control. You take that score and you enter it into the DoD's SPRS system, Supplier Performance Risk System. This is one of the values that goes into your overall supplier performance risk score that the contracting officers can utilize when they determine who they should let out on or who they should award a bid to. So when you start to think about NIST 800-171, what we're talking about is protecting controlled unclassified information. And the thing you're going to develop is what's called a system security plan. And that system security plan can either be across your entire business, or you can define the scope of that particular system. And the scope of that system is where CUI is stored, processed, or transmitted within your organization. The easiest way to determine the scope of this overall system security plan is to follow CUI into your company or your organization, determine what systems it is stored, processed, or transmitted from and to, who in your organization is authorized to see that information and work on it. It may be some people in your organization are support people, like your IT organization. They're doing your backups, recovery. They have administrative privileges on your file systems, things like that. So those are people who they they may never work on the CUI, but they have access to it. And so you've got to consider those kinds of people and systems as part of your overall system security. Part of system security may not only be in your IT systems. There may be and probably is a part of this element that is physical security. If you ever download, if you print, if you ever, physically manipulate that information or store it, all of those things come under the physical security controls. There are background checks and things about your hiring practices. So this isn't just an IT function. Please keep that in mind when thinking about your overall system security. And we'll cover that a little bit in those different controls as well. Now, when you think about those different systems that work or store or process or transmit that CUI, that assessment guide breaks down those different things when you're building that boundary into different categories of systems or people, right? There are those things which are considered CUI assets. Those are where you actually physically or digitally store, process, or transmit CUI. There are other physical and electronic things that just protect those overall systems. These are things like firewalls, as the diagram shows here. These are things like locks on doors, cameras, things like that. All of these are security protection assets. As I mentioned, you may have third parties that do some things for you or work on particular parts of your overall system. These are contractor risk managed assets, right? They may be managed by a third party, but those third parties may have access to the information. You may be actually working, for example, within a manufacturing company, you actually have a shop floor, you do some tool and die stuff, you have cutting machines, you have digital printers, 3D printers, etc. These are often specialized assets that they're in scope, but they may not be able to have some of the physical or even digital controls that you need over those systems. And then obviously in a large organization, you may have very many people and things in your organization that are outside the scope of your overall system security plan in regards to controlled unclassified information. You also need to kind of understand where those are, what those are, so they're not included as part of that overall system security plan. And so when the assessors come on site to assess your organization and your controls, you can, outline that overall system. You can tell them the boundary of that system and what that system includes and what those controls you have in place are to actually do the things outlined or required within NIST 800-171. Now, NIST 800-171, and we're talking NIST 800-171 R2, right? Rev 2. The reason that's important is because there is a Rev 3 out there. Now, NIST or CMMC and the Department of Defense specifically calls out R2, so that's what we're going to cover. There are 110 controls within these 14 control categories. Within those 110 controls, there are particular items that are required to be done. So, there are 14 control categories, 110 controls across those, and then I believe it's 330 individual kinds of things you've got to do across those different controls. And we'll see how that's broken out. So when we look to do a self-assessment, and the reason you want to do a self-assessment is two things really, right? As I let you know earlier, there is a clause today, right? DFARS 7019 that says you need to perform a self-assessment and score yourself. So if you've got that clause in your contract, this is a requirement you currently have. Now, you may also be receiving questionnaires or questions from organizations you work with asking you what your SPRS score is, and this is what they're actually looking for, right? They're looking at your score of your self-assessment of NIST 800-171. And the way you determine that is you look at the 800-171 alpha, the assessment guide. The assessment guide tells you what each control is. Using these determine if statements, it tells you what you've got to do within each of those controls. So this is taken straight from the guide. This is control 3.1.3, control of flow of CUI in accordance with approved authorizations. So within your implementation of this particular control, you should have flow control, you should have, information flow control policies are defined. How does CUI come into and out of my organization? Methods and enforcement mechanisms for controlling the flow of CUI are defined. Designated sources and destinations, network, individuals, devices for CUI within the system are identified, right? So that's that network diagram, that data flow diagram. That shows the auditors or the assessors that the extent of your system, what makes up that system. Authorizations for controlling the flow of CUI are defined. So who okays individuals in your organization to have access to this information? The authorizations for controlling the CUI are enforced, right? How are you enforcing those different controls? Do you have role-based access controls? Do you have Active Directory groups or Azure AD or Azure Entra groups? Sorry, I got to get my Microsoft parlance correct. And are the individuals of your organization trained and periodically tested and reviewed along those different controls? Now, if you've done all those things, then you get a point score for doing that particular control. And that's going to kind of determine your self-assessment. And you've got to do this for each of the 110 controls. Now, as I mentioned, you're going to get a point value. That point value is either going to be a 1, 3, or a 5, or on the flip side, a -1, -3, or -5. So your score is going to range somewhere between a -203 or a 110. Now, before you decide to engage with a third-party assessment organization, you've got to have like all of your items done, right? So you need a score of 110. Now, you'll often hear that, well, POA&Ms are allowed, but only for 1-point controls, and for 1-point controls, it's only certain 1-point controls. And those POA&Ms must be closed within 180 days. So what I would always suggest is you really don't want to engage with that third-party assessment organization until your self-assessment lets you know that you are at 110. That way, if they find a problem, you have time to correct it. That's that 180 days. Now, you've got to know these POA&M and their value, because again, when they come out and do their assessment, they can find some controls not implemented fully, and you'll be okay for that 6 months, that 180 days. But if it's not one of those allowed controls, or if it's those 3 or 5 controls, they're going to stop their assessment. They're going to tell you they can't complete it, and you're going to have to close those and then re-engage with them. So just keep that in mind when you're doing your assessment. It's another reason why self-assessments are important. You've got to know kind of where you stand before you decide to engage with that third-party assessment organization. Now, these are all the controls and their numeric value. on this page, and like I said, you're going to get the slide deck. So you'll be able to click on that link, pull up the assessment guide, see these different points. So these are all the 5-point controls and the 3-point controls. The ones that you don't see here are the 1-point controls. Now, these are the 1-point controls that you must have in place when you engage with that C3PAO, right? So even though these are 1-point controls, you've got to, if these are not in place, that third-party assessment organization is going to say, sorry, can't complete our assessment until these are in place. Please, fix this, and then we'll come back and we'll start our assessment all over. If you've got a 1-point control, not one of these, then that third-party assessment will say, okay, we can complete our assessment. We're going to note this. We're not going to pass you yet on the assessment. You've got 180 days to close this. Come let us know when you've implemented it. We'll check. We'll verify that you've done it, and then we'll close the assessment, pass you on it, and then we'll update that information in EMAS and let the government know, if you will, that you've now passed your level 2 C3PO assessment. So this is that, right? You've got that 180 days, and that you'll re-engage with that same assessment organization. They'll come back, they'll validate that you've done that, and then you'll be done for those 3 years. Okay. So let me show you how Exostar's Certification Assistant can help you with this process. So Certification Assistant is an application that allows you to really manage your overall CMMC program. It's going to walk you through this process. It's going to allow you to gather and write and include your policies, your implementation statements, your evidence that you've done those things into a central application, and it's going to generate those scores for you. It'll let you know, if you will, when you're ready to engage with that third-party assessment, or if you're filling out a survey or a questionnaire from somebody, you'll be able to answer, hey, this is my current score, this is what we're working toward, these are the POA&Ms I have open, and when I expect to have them closed. So let me go ahead and jump into that. So this is Exostar's Certification Assistant. Now, just to let everyone know, because this actually came up in one of the questions that were submitted. So Exostar purchased ComplyUp, an application, did something very similar. That is Exostar Certification Assistant now. So if you're a ComplyUp user, you're using Exostar Certification Assistant as well. If you were using our legacy application, we've moved you over, and now you're in, again, Certification Assistant. It's the same application. So with that said, so Certification Assistant, as I mentioned before, allows you to manage that overall CMMC program. It tells you your progress, right? Currently, this organization has a score of 32. What we've done is we've gone through each of the individual practices. We've said whether or not we've implemented them and completed them, whether or not they're in progress or not started. But what we've also done is put in the system in place and defined that overall system. So when we engage with that C3PO, and when we talk about our own organization, we understand what the extent of our system security plan is. So the first thing, right, all of this would be blank when you first open up Certification Assistant. But we're going to walk through and we're going to define that overall organization and the actual system where we store, process, or transmit CUI. So we've got our name, we've got who's responsible for it, we've put our logo in, who is the point of contact for these different things, phone numbers, emails, etc. We've started to define that overall system. This is where I've uploaded my network diagram and my system and my data flow diagrams. It's where I'm letting the organization know other systems that I'm leveraging. In this case, I'm leveraging a cloud service, Exostar's managed Microsoft 365. I'm also utilizing Microsoft's Intune that allows me to manage endpoints and things like that. Because I'm utilizing these systems, I inherit some of those 110 controls from these various providers. When I've done that, they've provided to me, as part of their requirements, a shared responsibility matrix, as well as the evidence of how they've implemented that, because these are FedRAMP moderate equivalent or FedRAMP moderate cloud services. And that body of evidence lets me know how they implemented those particular controls. So this again, so I'm just centralizing all that information. I'm defining that information. And then I'm going into those different practices, right? We've got those 110 controls. I could, if I click on practices here, it would take me to the practices themselves. I can get to them here. I can, jump to a particular one that I'm working on. So what I've been working on is NIST or 3.2.3. This is security awareness training. We've written our policy and procedure for our company. In this case, our company is Glory Minerals. Because we're utilizing a cloud service, right? This is a shared responsibility. This is the stuff I've got to do for my company. And then I've also put in the things that my cloud service is doing for their particular individuals as well. Right? So in these cases, I've laid that out as part of that overall implementation statement. And this is just a recommendation of how you might want to document implementation statements when a cloud service or an MSP might be part of that overall solution. So because I've done this, I'm going to jump to, let's see, this was, 3.2.3. So I lost my place there. So if I go to that particular practice right here, I can, domain awareness and training, insider threat awareness. So what am I doing around these, right? And these are the states, right? I'm currently not implemented this. So in this case, I could upload this documentation and just, link or put it in there that this is LinkedIn. I'm going to go ahead and actually just cut and paste instead. Now I'm going to get a little funky formatting, and I apologize for that when I cut and paste. So this is what we do, right? It's got the things that I just mentioned as well. So that's our implementation statement. If I wanted to, as I mentioned before, I could upload these things directly into here. So I've got this file here. Whoops, sorry, wrong file. We've gone ahead and we haven't reviewed this yet. This is our first one, but we're going to move this from implemented to not implemented. And we're going to, move on, if you will, to the next control. Now, if I needed additional information, there is guidance here to let me know. There are the questions that I need to answer that I have this before I move it to implemented, right? I shouldn't move it from not implemented to implemented before I know all these things are in place. Once I've done that, this is going to automatically upload. Now, before I move this to implemented, my score was at 32. This was a 1-point control, so now my score is 33. And I can also go in and see, I could update the POA&M that I had opened against this, right? This is 3.2.3. I can actually complete that POA&M, and we created it way back in 24, but now we've created this particular POA&M, but I've got other ones out there that I would now need to work. So that's how I can manage my overall program, because as I go through each of these controls, if I go to one of these that I haven't even started yet, like 3.1.6, and I haven't, and I can walk through each of those. This isn't started yet. I can say that I've not implemented it yet, and then I can create a POA&M for this, because this is then going to allow me to start to manage those controls to get completed. I'm gonna create the title, who's going to be working that, what state is it currently in, when was this particularly created, and then I can manage this POA&M to closure for this particular control. Then it'll show up on my dashboard as one of those new POA&Ms that I've got to have in place, or that I need to fix as we go forward. And then I can, get a quick update. Where am I doing this? How am I doing? And manage that overall program. And the reason I call it a program is because even though, once I get my 110 score, once I know I'm good, CMMC requires, or actually NIST 800-171 requires, in many of the controls, a periodic review of that control, or the evidence that you actually have that control implemented will be part of that periodic review process. A sign off that for that this control was reviewed once every year, a log sheet that says we provided access to our building to these visitors, those kinds of things. Those are all part of the evidence that you can also include in each of these controls, because when those assessors come on site, they're going to want to know those things as part of the overall documentation. So they're going to want to see your system security plan. They're going to want to see the evidence list of what you've done to show that you've actually implemented those controls. They're also going to ask your people to demonstrate, one of your implementation statements, or the way you implemented a particular control, and things like that. So, it is a pretty detailed assessment process. So hopefully that showed everybody kind of how you go through a self-assessment, how you score yourself, how something like Exostar Certification Assistant can help you centralize and manage that overall program, gather all that evidence in one place, and manage that approval and review process across your organization. Now, Certification Assistant is part of Exostar's CMMC Ready suite. This includes another companion application called Policy Pro. Policy Pro has templates for the 14 control families and the different controls within them. Those templates can be customized to fit your particular organization. It then includes an AI component, which allows you to run the control you just wrote through it, get a numerical score and hints of what you might want to do to improve that particular item. You get what are called KENNIs, key elements not included, for both the policy statements as well as general terms and things that you might want to have as part of that. Does things like word count as well to ensure that a policy is complete and is long enough to cover this particular control. You can also utilize it if you've got controls for other standards that you may have written for. So if your organization maintains ISO standards, you may have written a number of these kinds of policies before for different items. You can take those that you wrote, run them through, and get a score on how they relate to CMMC. See if you need to change anything around those. If you're looking for an enclave to store, process, and transmit CUI, Exostar's managed Microsoft 365 might be a solution for you. That is built on Microsoft Teams up in GCC High, allows you to manage those team spaces for your organization, wall off those people and that CUI just to those in your organization who are part of that overall CUI data flow. We also have a number of partners that can do really kind of any kind of CMMC assessment or work as a managed service provider for your overall CMMC program if you need some help from a services provider. This does include C3PA organizations that can help you get started as well, or I'm sorry, not help you get started, but when you're ready to actually take you through that CMMC assessment. Now, I'm going to ask my colleague Doe to go ahead and throw the poll out there for you. Love to have you take a minute and fill that out while I cover the questions that were submitted prior to today's session. So questions. So we offer a cloud service to DoD contractors who may have CUI, and I'm under the impression that we need FedRAMP moderate equivalent, or do we actually need CMMC level 2 to be compliant? So this is, a question we often get. So if you yourself aren't the DoD contract holder, but you provide a service to somebody that is, and that service is a cloud service, then you're looking to be FedRAMP moderate equivalent or be FedRAMP, right? Or be in the FedRAMP marketplace. So if you're a cloud service, it's FedRAMP moderate equivalent or in the FedRAMP marketplace. C, number 2, will there continue to be a requirement to submit SPRS scores for our sites with cage codes? Now, to tell you the truth, I don't know. So as long as you have a contract with that 7019 clause in it, you'll be required to go into the SPRS system and submit that overall CMMC, or not CMMC, I should say, NIST 800-171 score into that system. I don't know how that continues forward. The SPRS system will continue because your cybersecurity score, if you will, is only one component of that overall supplier performance. So that system will continue, but I don't know what, if you'll still be required to submit this score, because it should be 110 for everybody who's completed the assessment. It may be a little less than that, but it shouldn't be, but you'll have, or you'll be in that process of closing that out. But so I don't know, to tell you the truth, on number 2. So number 3, should a self-assessment be done instead of a gap analysis? I'm not quite sure, what the difference here is. So a self-assessment, when you go through and do a self-assessment, you'll identify those items that you don't have in place, and that'll identify the gaps you have. Now, if this is in relation to a third party, third parties often do what are called gap assessments, a gap analysis, where you are versus where you want to be, and they'll provide you a report of that. Those are very helpful. They can let you know where those are, and they also may go into depth about, well, this is, your staff may not have the skills to do this. You may need to engage with a third party to do some of these things, etc. So a gap analysis can be extremely helpful. A self-assessment should be done by your organization regardless of whether or not you're doing a gap analysis, because the self-assessment in conjunction with that gap analysis should tell you where you are and when you're ready to actually engage with that third party. Once you start to address the gaps that are identified, you should continually do that self-assessment to, again, know when you're ready to engage with that third party. So number 4, if we choose to host some applications locally, what would be our obligations? So if those applications you're hosting store, process, or transmit CUI, then they would be part of your overall data flow, and they would need to be protected in accordance with NIST 800-171. So in those cases, you'll have to have some kind of, typically things like role-based access controls to get access into those systems. You'll have to have some method of authorizing accounts into that system. You'll need to store information in those systems via, or store it encrypted with FIPS 140-2 encryption. Your account, if you're transmitting information, right, people are downloading files or something like that from those systems, those transmissions should also be encrypted. So those are your obligations for those systems will be, kind of NIST 800-171. You'll have to have those systems protected in accordance with that. So number 5, I find it challenging to know what is and is not acceptable solution for some objectives. For example, I hear conflicting arguments regarding shared credentials. Some say they are not permitted, others say they are when controlled. So NIST 800-171 is not, it outlines each of the different controls that you have in place, but it doesn't tell you how you need to achieve that particular control. It's not going to say, implement this technology or that kind of thing. I will say that shared credentials are often an issue with cybersecurity controls. The reason that shared credentials are an issue is that because they're shared, if something happens or it's identified that these credentials were used incorrectly, you don't actually know who used the credential because people are sharing it. So you may know that an activity happened, but you won't necessarily know who performed that activity because it's a shared credential. So that's often why shared credentials are not a good thing to have. And so why you typically need to tie a credential to an individual and actions, to a particular kind of credential. That's typically why I see them not being permitted in this. The other thing is that most assessors I've talked to, and this includes DIBCAC assessors I've talked to, what they've told me is if there is a technical control that could be in place to do an action, then it should be in place and not just done by policy. Sometimes things can only be done by policy and with training of your people in that particular policy, their recognition that they understand and will do that. But if instead that same kind of action can be governed by, a technical solution, then it's better to implement that via a technical control. So I've still got some other questions, but I just did want to take a quick commercial break. So I did let you know that you're going to receive this slide deck. As part of this, you'll get this slide with some additional sources of information. So please, if you need some additional help, you have some questions you're not sure of the answer to, this is a great source of those. So we got 3 more. So if we posted our score for self-attestation for 800-171 last year, do we need to do it again this year, or do we wait for the third-party certification to complete it? So this is going to be one of those, it depends. So if your score has significantly improved since last year, then I would say it does make sense to go ahead and update your score in the SPRS system. And the reason for that is, it can be a competitive advantage to have a higher SPRS score than others. So if you've improved your score, I'd certainly go in and update mine. If it's still the same, if it was 110, last year, then it's not going to improve when that third-party assessment comes through, then I'd wait. If it's the same, I'd wait. So it's really kind of depends on whether or not you've been able to improve it. Number 7, get a lot of questions around FIPS 142. So we are very, very puzzled by FIPS 140-2 and FIPS 140-3 requirements for our small business. We've received a quote from a provider of HSM, hardware security module device, and 100 certificates for over 150K with a subscription fee of 50K per year going forward. We only have a handful of servers and 25 laptops, workstations. We have BitLocker turned on nearly all these machines, and we're planning to turn on the FIPS 140-2 portion of that. We're unsure whether we need certificates and for which aspect. So FIPS 142, just for those who don't know, is the encryption standard that's outlined in NIST 800-171. So if you're using encryption, and you should be to store and transmit CUI, that encryption algorithm that's used has to be in accordance with FIPS 142. So it's got to be a FIPS 142 approved algorithm. Hardware security modules often use a FIPS 142 encryption method for their encryption, but hardware security modules are typically used for credentials. So what that means is rather than typing in a username and password and then getting a one-time token over my phone, my multi-factor authentication is a fob or a hardware certificate, and that hardware certificate is within, a USB device that I plug into my computer, a CAT card, something like that. Those HSMs provide, if you will, a surety that you are the person who was provided this particular credential. So they're protecting that, right? It's that, okay, this person is Kevin, and Kevin has authorization to this system. It's tied to this particular account, and he gets in. That doesn't have anything to do with the encryption, which that application uses to send me or store information. So, both things are required for NIST 800-171. So you typically need multi-factor authentication to get into systems that store, process, or transmit CUI. Some people choose an HSM type device to have that authentication into the system. The things like BitLocker, or which is an application within Microsoft Windows, which can be used to encrypt a device. And you can choose a FIPS 142 encryption algorithm to encrypt that device. So think of 140-2 algorithms to encrypt data at rest and to encrypt data in transit. And HSM devices are your credential to access that information within an application. So hopefully that cleared up kind of what those things all do and what that is. So where to find low-cost or no-cost role-based training for engineers and IT department. So if you just need training on CUI, I would actually take a look at the DoD's website, right? dodcui.mil. That has a lot of free training just about CUI. It's pretty, and it's a good source. Now, if you want training on policies and procedures around protecting it, these are typically things you do. So it's kind of what you're going to have to develop to train your people to do those. There are a number of other system, there are services out there that provide training on like cybersecurity basics and and email phishing and all those kinds of stuff. Those I don't have any great recommendations for. So everyone, that concludes my formal presentation. Hopefully everyone enjoyed that and got some information from it. I'm just going to go take a look and see if anything came over chat or Q&A that I need. Got a bunch of AI assistants starting. Let's see. Does the certification assistant support other compliance framework like ISO 27001? The answer for that's no. So certification assistant is really just for CMMC, and it's tuned for NIST 800-171. Question, will Policy Pro note a prompt for shared responsibility documentation? It does not. It doesn't know anything about other systems that you utilize, so you'd have to get that shared responsibility matrix from your different providers. Let's see, is there... All right, let me go to the Q&A session. So we got a question about, I have Exostar Access. Is there an extra cost for certification assistant? There is. Certification assistant is an additional application from the Exostar portfolio. You can go to the website and get information about, you know, how to order it, its process, its pricing, etc. So I think that answers all the questions that came in. I want to thank everybody for your time and attention today. Hope everyone has a great day, and I hope you have a great rest of the week. Thanks so much.